Thank you for joining me today on Leading Today. I'm Dr. Lisa Bagby. In the last episode, I reflected on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the way empathy and compassion showed up in his leadership, not as softness, but as moral clarity and courage. Today, I want to bring this conversation into our modern workplaces and into your daily leadership behaviors. Remember, this podcast is about helping you as a leader go from good to great. So let's start by framing the problem just a little bit. Many leaders believe they are empathetic and compassionate, and often they intend to be. But empathy and compassion are not intentions. They are experienced behaviors. And here's where leaders get a little tricky. Some of their behaviors are interpreted as empathetic and compassionate, while others are mistaken for them. So today we'll talk about a few key takeaways. We'll talk about behaviors that leaders often assume are empathetic, but they are not. We'll talk a little bit about what empathy and compassion look like, both overtly and covertly. I'll talk a little bit, too, about what research tells us happens to teams when leaders do get this right, and then a little on what happens when they don't. And then I'm going to give you 3 simple practices that you can start immediately, because I always want to leave you with some takeaway, whether it's reading, whether it's a practice, or something else that you can actually utilize as soon as you're done listening to the podcast. So I want to talk a little on overt versus covert behaviors where empathy and compassion are concerned. So overt empathy is easy to recognize. Overt empathy is visible. It's like empathetic leaders who are authentic. They say things like, I can see this has been hard for you, or help me understand what you're experiencing. I'm listening. Or maybe they say something like, that makes sense given what you're carrying. These are explicit signals that many leaders understand or even really say. And the covert empathy, which is often missed or misunderstood, is really where some of the difference kind of lay in that. It can be overlooked in some cases. The covert empathy is the quieter, but just as powerful emotional intelligence skill. The examples that leaders might demonstrate in covert empathy are things like pausing a decision after hearing new context. So you're just not immediately jumping in or running over what someone may have just shared. It's about not interrupting, especially when emotions show up. You're honoring that moment. You're giving space and grace to that individual who might be sharing. The other is following up later, not just in the moment. And that's really key. I'm going to circle back to that one too. But the other is something like adjusting expectations without announcing it based on information or new information attained. And then one more example, it is maybe protecting dignity in public, yet addressing performance in private. You're demonstrating respect also to the individual. But to a team member, these behaviors say, I matter, I'm seen, I'm safe here. And behaviors that leaders think are empathetic but aren't, it's kind of like, this is where, for instance, impact and intent kind of split. Think of it like giving someone a sweater that fits you, but not them. They can wear it, but it won't really fit or look proper. So a couple of examples around that are things like jumping in too quickly for problem solving. And we all have an innate nature to want to solve a problem for someone or help them solve the problem without really taking the time to let them simply share. The other is saying something like, well, I understand, but you haven't really listened deeply. Another is minimizing feelings with positivity. And that can be, saying something like, oh, I'm sure it'll be okay. Another is treating everyone, quote, the same instead of equitably. You've got to recognize that there are differences between people, and those needs require that those differences are seen and subsequently addressed. The other, or the last I would say, is really about being nice but not available or unavailable. Empathy isn't about being agreeable, okay? It's about being attuned. So let's talk a little bit about what the science says are the psychological benefits for teams who have an empathetic or a compassionate leader. So for the leader, research, it really consistently shows that leaders who demonstrate empathy or compassion experience higher trust and credibility among their teams, greater influence, reduced conflict escalation, meaning conflicts can get resolved much earlier on and generally a little more amicably. There's also stronger followership commitment. So your team is willing to follow you or be led by you without a whole lot of additional questions. They trust you. Now, for the team, empathy and compassion really sort of activates key psychological conditions. So one that we've heard a lot about and continue to hear a lot about is psychological safety. And that's really very important. They have belonging that they experience. There's more motivation and engagement, lower burnout and turnover, and higher discretionary effort. Now, you've heard me talk a little about higher discretionary effort in one of my previous episodes, but that higher discretionary effort is the effort where someone goes above and beyond, or the team, as the case might be, they go above and beyond what you either expected, asked them for, or what have you, but they do it without it feeling burdensome. They are committed to helping the project advance forward or get completed maybe a little bit sooner, and they don't see it as burdensome or something that's going to lead to their feeling, tired or overworked, generally speaking. But a really simple explanation is that when people feel emotionally safe, the brain moves out of threat mode. And when the brain isn't in threat mode, people think better. They collaborate better. They perform better. This is why creativity and innovation thrive in settings or environments where people feel safe, quote unquote. But now, how teams will respond behaviorally when it comes to a leader who demonstrates empathy and compassion, and they experience that empathy and compassion from their leader. Remember, it's about the experience. Teams will lead with empathy. Teams who lead with an empathetic leader will speak up sooner. They will admit mistakes faster. They will offer solutions instead of silence, and they'll stay during the hard seasons. So when times are either super busy, or maybe sometimes when it's really slow, depending on what the business is, these are the times that people will go ahead and stay. They're not going to be looking for another job or looking to leave their current position, as the case might be. But it's about the empathetic and compassionate leader that has helped create an environment that team really does want to stay. Empathy, it doesn't lower the standards. It actually raises the commitment by the individual employee, the caregiver, the teams. Now, on the other side of it, when empathy is missing, you have culture by default. Every leader creates culture, either intentionally or by default. So common environments that are created by low empathy leadership, they are fear-based. Fear-based compliance occurs. There's silence instead of feedback. Higher turnover of high performers. Those are the people you really want to make sure stay with the organization. There's also emotional exhaustion. And then lastly, it's performative professionalism that shows up. People who pretend that everything is fine, largely because they're afraid to signal to the leader that it is not. But what's important to understand is this. A lack of empathy doesn't create neutrality. It creates harm, even if unintentionally. And so what's the long-term impact? Well, over time, teams stop bringing their whole selves, and eventually they stop bringing their best thinking. So your innovators, your creators, your cutting edge thinkers or thought partners stop contributing. Now, building empathy and compassion authentically is what I want to talk to you about next. Empathy, you must remember, isn't necessarily just a personality trait. It's a skill. It is something that you can develop, make stronger, and demonstrate more clearly. And so when you're thinking about what it is in authenticity, it's about practicing curiosity over judgment or presence over performance. And what I think is one of the most important is listening to understand, not to reply. Oftentimes we have leaders who speak very quickly after someone has shared, and they don't have an opportunity to really take in what their speaker has just shared with them. So you don't have to feel what someone else is feeling per se, but you have to honor what they feel. If you feel what they feel, that is outstanding. That's compassion and empathy at its highest action. But the empathy muscle analogy I would like to share is really like any muscle, actually. You will strengthen it with intentional, repeated use. And it doesn't require grand gestures. It's just the small, consistent actions that you as the leader take or demonstrate to an individual, an employee, a caregiver, or your team, as the case might be. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I always want to leave you with some takeaways. And I talked about 3 simple practices. I want to share these because these are things that you can use immediately. So one is practicing the 90-second pause. I know that sounds like a really long time, but try and employ that tactic, okay? You hear someone speak, pause for 90 seconds. Let them know you're taking a minute to process what you just heard. But when that emotion shows up, pause before responding. And that helps because it allows emotional regulation for them as well as for you. Because you don't know how you're going to necessarily feel in the moment based on whatever it is that they're sharing with you. You might feel sad. You might feel grief. You might feel frustration or upset. So that pause allows you to emotionally regulate. It allows them to do the same. The other is that it prevents or reduces defensiveness. So if the individual was feeling defensive, or if you were starting to feel defensive because you're attuned to yourself, then that can help bring that down to a more reasonable level that the communication and the conversation can be more adjusted. Your compassion and your empathy shows up instead. But the other, above all, is that doing those things signals respect for the individual, for the conversation, for the moment. that sacred space that may be showing up at the time. And you can simply respond and say, hey, tell me more about that. Now, another practice that you can take into consideration is to name what you notice without fixing. Remember, we talked about this earlier. You don't want to problem solve necessarily. You might encourage the individual to think of how they can solve the problem, or the team, if that's what's applicable, but it's not about you fixing what the issue is or what it is that you necessarily notice. So you can simply say, I'm noticing this is frustrating for you. You're not offering a solution. You're not justifying anything. You're just acknowledging what it is that you are experiencing or observing from your speaker. The last practice is about closing the loop. Now, I cannot stress this enough because this really can make the difference. Empathy is really not complete until there's follow through. You want to check back in with your individual, your caregiver, your team. You want to reference the past conversation or conversations, and you want to adjust the expectations transparently. So when you circle back, if you had someone who has shared something with you, maybe calendar a follow-up that's a couple days to a week away. You will have to adjust based on what you deem appropriate. But when you circle it back up with that person, make sure that you have dedicated time to really do it so that you're not being interrupted. That's very important. But the other is to reference the past conversation that had you doing the follow-up. So it could be, hi, I wanted to check in on you. The last time we spoke, you talked about fill in the blank. And I just wanted to see where you're at with that, or how you're feeling about that, or how have things been since then. Those are just some examples of how you can close that loop. That lets the individual know that you care, that you are leaning into empathy or compassion, but that more than anything, you really want to follow that up, and you give enough thought to them to ask them, how are they doing? I want you all to pick one practice, just one, and use it consistently for 2 weeks. Because consistency is what makes empathy believable, all right? So you can also reference previous readings that I've mentioned. There's Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence, or Brene Brown, Dare to Lead. There's a new one by Emma Sapala that is called The Happiness Track. But any of those would be good. But read one, revisit it slowly, and let it shape your behavior, not just the words or the language. Remember though, empathy and compassion aren't just soft skills. They are strategic leadership behaviors too, but they should be applied authentically. The question isn't whether you care. The question is whether people experience the care through your actions. Because leading today requires more than results. It requires humanity. So I want to thank you for joining me today. And until next time, lead with clarity, courage, and compassion. I'm Dr. Lisa Bagby, and until next time, enjoy your day or your week. But thank you for listening to Leading Today.